Thank you, Nikki. My name is Claire Jauregui, and I'd like to acknowledge tonight that we are on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish. I want to honor the land itself and the Duwamish people, past and present, for their stewardship and caretaking of the land. The Duwamish have been denied federal recognition as a tribe, and the Point Elliott Treaty of 1855 promising land, healthcare, education, and fishing rights has still not been honored. So I hope that you'll join me and SPA in supporting justice for the Duwamish by paying a monthly sum to real rent. All the funds go to the Duwamish Tribal Services and that's run by the Duwamish tribe. Really glad to have you here. Welcome to Cara McKinley and Wendy Orville. They are our featured artists for tonight. And this is the second of 5 conversations that we're having with a lot of the artists from the 2020 Contemporary Northwest Print Invitational at Davidson Galleries. Excited that Sam Davidson is here with us tonight. Hi, Sam. Thanks for joining us. And it opens tomorrow, so you can make an appointment with Rebecca to go socially distance see the show, wearing masks and I think gloves. Nikki is putting everything in the chat, so you can refer to that for making appointments, as well as seeing the show online at davidsongalleries.com. And we brought in Thea Kire-Tagle as the juror, and she's a scholar, educator, curator, and writer. And she did a really great job of grouping the work for the show. And today it's a fun kind of contrast of landscape styles with Cara and Wendy. So I'm going to turn on screen sharing so we can see the pieces that they had accepted into the show. And I'm going to have them introduce themselves and we'll start a conversation. So Wendy, do you want to go first to introduce yourself?
Yeah, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for arranging this and having this chance for us to connect during this time where we don't see each other. I'm just, I'm so thankful that that we're all able to have this conversation tonight and each week. So thank you all, Nikki and Claire and Davidson Galleries. So my name is Wendy Orrbell. I focus primarily on monotype. I was trained as a painter. I have both a BA and an MFA in painting. And I wasn't trained as a printmaker. I worked for about 4 days with a master printer when I was in Taos, New Mexico, after a period of about 10 years of painting. And I decided to make that switch. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but I had become allergic to oil paint. So I was so delighted to find this medium that I just fell in love with and have really just continued with for the last 25 years or so. Is that true? God, that sounds like a long time. But I think it's true. And I live on Bainbridge Island. I moved to Seattle about 25 years ago, and then to Bainbridge about 17 years ago. And I show it at Davidson Gallery, which has been an incredible fit for me. And I just feel thankful all the time for having being able to work with Sam and Rebecca and the gallery. So so that's a little bit about me.
Great, thank you so much. Welcome. And Cara.
Hello, everyone. I am also very happy to be here and second everything that Wendy said about it being nice to still be able to get together even in these difficult times, and really excited to be a part of the show as well. So I have a degree in graphic design, but have been working as a software engineer for the last 10 years or so. And I got into printmaking just a few years ago. I've been doing art in various forms for most of my life, but one of my great-great-grandfather was an etcher named Earl H. Reed. And my family has some of his etchings on the wall. And I was visiting home and was looking at them and thinking like, gosh, like, I wonder if I could learn how to do this, because it seems like it'd be up my alley. It's like very detailed, really kind of like a nice, small, but doesn't have to be small, but small pieces that can draw you in. And so I ended up looking up art classes in Seattle, and it turns out that Pratt, which is actually very close to where I live, was offering etching classes. So I decided to try out some of the classes and just totally fell in love with etching, and then worked out some ways to try to make my own makeshift studio, and it's basically become a very serious endeavor since then. So yeah, that's my background.
Cool. Great, thank you. So I'm going to turn off my screen sharing, and we will jump into the conversation. Let's see. Whoop. I guess, Cara, let's talk a little bit about your etching setup, because I don't really know anything about electro etching.
So
no, everybody loves the technical.
Yeah. So yeah, my basically all of like electro etching and the other etching techniques that I currently use arose out of an effort to try to have a studio at home, and that also necessitated sort of reducing toxicity of some things and the waste of some activities. So I needed to find ways in which I could have a small setup that didn't produce a lot of waste or like toxic hazards or anything. I don't have a utility sink, so I have to be able to pour things down the drain in my kitchen. And so I wanted to make sure that nothing I was doing was going to make anyone sick or hurt the environment and all of that. So yeah, so I ended up just doing a ton of Google searching like toxic setups, and stumbled upon an article, a PDF, I think, that was originally written in Spanish, I think by some printmakers in Spain, that mentioned something about electro etching. I was like, what's that? So then I ended up finding some YouTube videos of people that were using electro etching not to do etching intaglio, but to plate jewelry. And so the process for electro etching is essentially like jewelry plating, but in reverse. So instead of adding fine metal to a piece of jewelry, you're taking it away from a copper plate. So the setup involves a tank of copper sulfate, which is an electrolyte, and you just need a simple weak power supply, which you can get from any electronics store online. And you basically, what I use is I can show things. I use a bread cooling rack. So there's a steel bread cooling rack. And this just goes in, I think you can kind of see it. The tank of copper sulfate is over there, but basically you can put this in the copper sulfate mixture, attach one of the ends of the power supply, I think the cathode, to this, and then attach the other power supply, the anode, to the copper plate, which is sitting in the electrolyte. And then I just turn on the power supply and put about 0.5 volt through it. It's not even enough to feel if you touch the metal, so there's not really risk of like getting shocked or anything. And it works very much like traditional etching medium, ferric chloride. Is that the original, the mordant? But yeah, it essentially works in much the same way, where it's pulling copper molecules off of the plate. It behaves in slightly different ways. Like the electricity is much more directional, so you tend to not get underbiting or things like that, or foul biting on the plate. which is nice. But then it's also got some kind of like unpredictable quirkiness to it, with the way that the electric waves, I guess, pass through the electrolyte and where they hit the plate. And so sometimes you'll get what's called an edge effect, which is that near edges of things, it'll actually end up biting it a little bit more. But I find that those sort of uncontrolled behaviors are not so extreme that you can't correct for them. So what I usually end up doing is just kind of like burnishing things here and there or darkening things, and can kind of achieve like a nice even effect after that. But yeah, I don't know, anything else I can elaborate on there.
Cool. I guess in terms of correcting for some of those known, I don't know what to call them, but those known edge effects, like, do you feel like it's really consistent that you're able to really just say, oh, I know this is going to do this, or there's still that unpredictability that printmaking is?
Yeah, there's still a good amount of unpredictability. Over time, I've sort of started to get a feel for like what I think will happen. So particularly if you have like areas that you've scraped away from the ground that are kind of far away from other things, those will tend to be bitten darker than very close together lines. And so occasionally, like if I'm making a plate where I've got a lot of cross hatching over here, but then I have like one little detail off to the side, I might end up doing a step etch and etch that little detail off to the side slightly less, because I know it's going to end up darker, and that's worked out as well. It's mostly like the dark lines that you have to worry about, because obviously those are harder to correct for. So.
We have a question from Linda who's saying, are you using the grounds in the same way for the etching process?
Yeah, so, and this might, we can get more into like the non-toxic grounds, but I use an acrylic-based ground that I've mixed together out of floor polish, latex, and India ink. And so that works much like a traditional hard ground, except it smells like shampoo instead of nasty chemical. But yeah, you apply it the same way as like a traditional hard ground. And then to kind of set it a little stronger, you can heat it. I just use a hair dryer to heat it, and that seems to be enough heat. And then that'll kind of make sure that it doesn't start breaking down in the etch. So.
Nice. So you're venturing into less toxic ways of printing. Didn't necessarily have to do with like allergies, but rather like working from home and not wanting to have, you know, filtration systems and other other setups to make sure that things weren't dangerous.
Yeah. I mean, and of course there's always the health concerns, like, you know, cumulative effects. You never know like what happens over time. So for me, it's like, if I can, it's better overall, or like I might as well, if I can, make it less toxic. It'd be better for everything all around. So.
Yeah. And Wendy, speaking to your developing sensitivity to, you know, the oil paint, you want to talk a little bit about that and how that influenced your work, your printmaking work, and yeah, where you've gone with that over the years.
Well, I think I was always allergic to oil paint, and this was, you know, the 80s, where people didn't have ventilation and they didn't wear gloves, and there was macho, and people used white lead paint, which we were encouraged to use. I mean, that's a long ago era, but I think I absorbed a lot of toxins during that time. And so I would get headaches I couldn't get rid of. I couldn't remember words. But I kept going because I loved painting, and it just felt like it was part of the process of being a painter, that you had to kind of suffer on some level. Mm-hmm. And so when I found Monotype, I just felt really different physically. But I think also I felt really free, kind of inventing too. So it was this combination of being unself-conscious, not knowing, in a way, not knowing what I didn't know. I felt like I could invent things, and then I just felt I didn't have headaches. I've never had a reaction to it. So I use oil-based inks. I clean up with baby oil. I don't use medium for the most part in my work. So most of my, instead of using brushes and medium, I tend to just create my lights through wiping with cloths. I use a lot of transparent ink also, and roll out transparencies and gradations. But I tend not to use brushes, and really a lot of the detail is coming from using credit cards and squeegees and brushes a little bit, but without it being wet. I'm removing ink to kind of create form more. Mm-hmm. So it just feels really it's just pleasurable, and so I feel really lucky that I stumbled into it, because I would have had to give it up. I know that I would have had to give up the painting at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I remember being at the demo last year at Barn, and mm-hmm. I mean, I think that what I really loved about seeing you work and like hearing you talk about your work now was that like joy, and like also that that freedom of, you know, trying all these different things and it being really open for you, but then mm-hmm. also your process is very like, you know, you have a lot of steps of getting to the place that you want.
Yeah. Well, and I actually, one of the things that I figured out was, because when I was a painter, I did plein air landscape painting, and then I made incredibly abstract work. So people would come up to me when I was painting and they'd be like, "Are you looking at anything? What are you doing?" and it was often kind of chaotic in a way, although it was exciting, you know, on some level for me. But what I discovered was that I really like working in, I like being fairly structured and then loose within these different kind of structures. And mm-hmm. so I do a lot of drawing. I'll print sketches first of the different things I'm interested in. Like if I'm gonna put a tree into a finished piece, I'm gonna do multiple kind of monotype sketches without trying to actually print them onto the atmospheric ground. And so I'm able to experiment, but in a kind of structured way, and I make a lot of work, and so, you know, and then I don't show a lot of that, and I'm fine with that. I just figured out that the most important thing was for me to you know, make work and then edit like crazy, and so that's what I do, and then I'm not so precious about everything having to come together in some finished way.
Sure. And so all of your monotypes have multiple layers of.
Yes. Is
there a number, like, do you have a general number, or is it just all over the place in terms of like how many layers you?
Well, I think I usually begin with making a kind of atmospheric ground. And if that ground feels believable to me, like it can't just be a background, like, oh, I could use this as a background. It has to have this life to it, and I have to believe that it's a very, you know, spatial field. So I almost always start with a kind of gradated ground, and then you know, it varies. Sometimes it's just 2 layers. Sometimes it's, you know, 5. It just depends. And sometimes a layer can be, you know, a tiny little addition. But then the other thing I do is it doesn't need to go through the press. So I'll actually add ink with, you know, with a credit card directly, or I'll do what I need to do to finish the work in the way that feels right to me. So mm-hmm. I think that's the painter side of me. That's like, I don't know, I'm not super strict as a printmaker. I just try to go after the work as best I can. Mm-hmm. And I'll do whatever I think to do to kind of get there.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. Cara, can you speak a little bit to your like process of like how many times the prints will go through, your prints will go through the press, or you know, your inspiration for your subjects? You're both working in a landscape for these particular pieces, but that's not to say that's always so.
Yeah, so my process, I usually start with photo collage, actually, just on computer. So I sort of like gather source materials and references from all over the internet, and use that to kind of like form my composition and sizing and proportions and everything, just make sure that I can achieve the image that I want to achieve. And then I use, usually just like print that out on my LaserJet printer, and then use that with transfer paper to transfer the outlines of things, so that everything's proportioned correctly on the plate. And then I usually start with a light outline first. So I'll go back over the lines I've transferred from my initial sketch, and usually do like a 20-minute etch, which is kind of like a medium light gray, for the initial outlines. And then from there, I kind of set aside the photo collage. I still use it for referencing, shading and everything, but I kind of just like go with the plate at that point. And I usually try to do darkest lines first, then go to medium grays, then go to light grays. And I might do like more than just those 3 steps, but I just do different etchings. I found that, I don't know if it's the ground I'm using or electrolyte, but usually trying to do step etches with the same ground doesn't work super well. I start to, like, every time I have to rinse off the plate and then touch it with my hands, it tends to like break down the ground a little bit. So I usually just do one timed etch, clean off the ground, do a test print maybe, reapply ground, then do like the next step of etching. And then usually I get to a point where things are like starting to formulate. I've got like darks, mediums, lights in, but there's still a lot of adjustment to be made. And so then I'll go back through, either redo darks, redo medium, redo light, sometimes all together on the same plate if I can manage it, and do etching delicately. And then in the final step, I'll usually do burnishing and some dry point if there's just like little spots that need a little boost. And I used to do test prints kind of after like every single step, but I think now I'm starting to get enough eye for the plate to know like when something's going to turn out. So I don't need to do as many prints. But I try to do like a test print, you know, every other etching step or so, just to make sure I'm on the right track and that there's nothing like strange going on in the plate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Linda was asking, do you use Aquatint, or what about Aquatint?
Yeah, and again, this kind of overlaps with the non-toxic stuff, but I don't do traditional Aquatint with resin because of space and because of toxicity issues, not toxicity necessarily, but safety issues with breathing it in and having it in my garage and things. And so I've been experimenting with sandpaper aquatinting, which is finicky, but I'm still working through the best way, how to get the best result with that. But yeah, I have 400 grit sandpaper, I think. And I usually, what I've figured out works best is cutting several pieces of sandpaper to the size of the plate. And then I can, the reason for multiple pieces is because each sandpaper piece will have, you know, the sandpaper grit in a certain pattern. And so you don't want to just use the same paper over and over. Otherwise you'll get kind of a lumpy looking halftone pattern. So sort of like the more sheets of sandpaper you can use, and if it's a rectangular plate, then you can flip it once and get more mileage out of the paper. But you put the paper over the plate and then run the plate through the press, which ends up imprinting the sandpaper in the hard ground. So you end up with a sort of halftone pattern, sort of like traditional aquatint. And I usually run that with paper through the press about 20 times. It's really tedious. there's very little chemical or anything involved in that, which is nice. And then it essentially works pretty similar to a traditional aquatint. Again, with the Electro Etch and the ground that I'm using, I find that going any longer than like 25 or 30 minutes, the ground will start to break down again. So I haven't yet quite figured out how to make an efficient, fully dark black tone with it. I think it can be achieved if you just do that process enough times so that it darkens. But yeah, it's still a work in progress, or I'm still trying to refine the process. But yeah, it's a nice method because you don't have to deal with solvents or removing anything. I don't need a hot plate for it. So yeah, it's pretty low mess process.
Cool. Okay, so I might have a couple clarifying questions. So there's no ground on the plate when you're doing the sandpaper?
There is.
There
yeah.
is.
So there's still hard ground on the plate, yeah. And I think that's the trickiest part of the process, and also has to do with the ground that I use, which is a little unruly. I apply it just with a brush, which is fine when you're just doing line etching. But with a Sandpaper Aquatint, of course, you want it to be a really even, smooth coverage of ground. And I've had trouble achieving that with the ground that I use. It tends to have streaks from the brush, or even if I use like a sponge brush, still a little bit streaky. And so that can impact how much the sandpaper gets pushed into the plate, and therefore how dark the etched areas are. I have considered changing to a different kind of ground, like one of the other acrylic based or soy based maybe grounds that are out that you can apply with a brayer to maybe achieve a more even effect, but I just haven't gotten around to that experiment yet. So,
I mean, do you feel like, how much of the unpredictability of, making the aquatint with the sandpaper and, this process that, you're still figuring out exactly how it's responding to what you want or doing what you want, like, do you feel like you try to incorporate that into your work, or that no, you want to keep it as controlled as possible to what is in your brain?
good question. So in some cases it works out almost in my favor, like the tardigrades piece that's in the show. I use Sandpaper Aquatint for, and there's a lot of like grassy areas, and so it looks okay if it's a little splotchy, because that's kind of how land normally looks. So in like natural scenes and things that already have a lot of texture, it doesn't end up really creating any problems, or can sometimes add, some nice like noise to the picture. I'm working on another piece right now though that involves, it's an indoor scene, and so there's white walls in the background that have some shadow to them. And so in that case, it's a little bit trickier, because with like a flat architectural surface, you don't necessarily want splotches and things like that. So I think it kind of depends on the piece. And I'd like to figure out a way to make it smoother in the cases that I need it. But I'm mostly happy with it for many of the pieces that I make.
Great. And so I think I'd love to hear a little bit about your inspiration for your imagery, both for the pieces like in the show and then in general. How about I share my screen a little bit again, and then maybe Wendy, if you want to start and talk about your inspiration.
So my inspiration for this piece is from a park about 15 minutes from my house. It's called Rockaway Beach Park, and there are these very strange basalt volcanic rocks, and they're not that big. I deliberately, in a way, made it bigger than it feels when you're there. But I love the I love how strange, almost like an animal, or I don't normally kind of emphasize those things, but there's something just very mysterious to me about those rocks. at Rockaway. And for my idea for the piece was to create a really small piece that that had expansive space. And so that contrast of almost like a small window with a kind of endless space. And then I wanted to use a couple different techniques. So the sky is subtractive and just through wiping away. And then the rocks I made by cutting mylar actually, and then inking it up and then printing them together. So I wanted that that tension between atmosphere and sharpness, or different kinds of motion coming together, and that's often something that I'm drawn to in when I'm working, which is to have a kind of almost imbalance, or these different kinds of dynamics kind of working not necessarily against each other, but to make something feel like it's alive and interesting to me. I feel like it can't just sit there. It has to be kind of activated, and so that was the initial inspiration.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, maybe this goes more back to technique, but maybe it's an inspiration question too, or like the subject matter, and like creating these different spaces from all the different elements from your photographs or your travels, mm-hmm. and like how, these are imaginary spaces.
Yeah, they really are. So I always look at something when I'm working, but I'm pulling, like the sky, for example. I've printed that sky in multiple different ways, large, small, vertical. And I play with elements almost like they're characters. And then I that's how I'm able to kind of get some fluency with the different forms. And then I'll kind of play with different kinds of landscape forms on top, and it creates these different worlds. And so I'm looking and I'm photographing all the time. I mean, I'm watching the sky. I'm obsessed with just what happens in the sky, and I'll pull over and with whatever I'm doing and stop and photograph. And then I'll do drawings from the photos, so that it's not just some kind of a one-for-one where I'm taking something I've seen and just making a print out of it. I'll draw it in pencil and charcoal and big, and just to kind of see what its potential is. And then I combine it in different ways. And so it becomes more interesting to me, because I'm not just like staring at a photograph and trying to somehow make an impression. I'm not interested in making an impression. I really want something that feels more alive, and that's more of an equivalent of how it feels to look at the sky, right? Kind of capturing some of that motion of looking at the sky.
Mm-hmm. So pieces that are creating work that's evoking emotion, mm-hmm. more than maybe a narrative.
Yeah, I if there's a narrative, I don't usually know what that is, but it has to have, maybe some secret or some draw. It can't just be that it looks good to me, or that it's visually kind of exciting. Like I want it to feel like it has some, mystery for me. So not everything is appealing to me, or I'm always kind of on the lookout for, landscape that feels, really evocative to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. And Cara, how about you? I mean, I think I sort of threw in that narrative to Wendy, because I think, if I'm remembering correctly, that your work is more about storytelling and narrative.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I really enjoy trying to tell stories in the work, and so my work tends to be a little bit more illustrative to that end. And I usually work on a small format, because I like the sense of having a lot of detail and fine detail and something that kind of like draws you in to look and find more, even though it's a small piece. It's sort of like a small window. It's like a looking glass or something into a world. So this tardigrade piece, the inspiration behind this is I had known about tardigrades sorry, looks like my screen might have frozen. No, I'm okay. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, I had learned about tardigrades some time ago, I think on some, meme thread about like, look at all these crazy microscopic creatures that live among us. And then they've also like oddly become kind of a popular thing in a lot of sci-fi recently, or and also a lot of like kids content. I've had a few friends, kids note about this tardigrade piece, or so be like excited that I made a piece about tardigrades. But yeah, they're very small microscopic creatures. They're really pretty cool creatures. I guess they've been sent into space before and have survived it. They're super hardy. They're like the creatures that would exist after everything else on the planet is gone. And so what was interesting to me is this thought of what is familiar versus not familiar to us, and like what makes something alien and strange. And so I thought it might be fun to kind of put tardigrades in the place of cows in a field, kind of put them in a situation in which something very normal like a cow, nobody would think twice about really. And there's a strange creature which looks alien or made up or something very unfamiliar, and kind of the reaction that creates. So, and then of course people might wonder like, what are these things? Why are they there? What are they doing? Where did they come from? So I like evoking those kinds of questions, I guess, in my work, and just letting people's imagination go wherever they might go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm gonna stop sharing right now. I guess I wonder, I mean, maybe it feels also maybe like Theo was thinking about it in the way of like how we're kind of reevaluating everything right now with COVID and Black Lives Matter uprisings. And I mean, were you thinking about any of that directly, or is it kind of more?
Yeah, so this piece I made prior to everything happening. And so that wasn't a direct inspiration, but I definitely intended the piece to have a sort of like inviting self-reflection on like, how do we perceive things, and how do we judge things, and how do we decide what is normal versus not? So I would say in that sense, it is about, sort of normalcy and alienness and uncomfortableness at what, like how we set those norms, I guess.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that feels very appropriate for this time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think what I'd love us to maybe talk about, or, please feel free to go in a different direction, but is kind of this particular time, and maybe what your studio practice looks like, what you are thinking about, how has it changed it, how has it changed or stayed the same, and like, are there parallels in your past for how you're dealing with all the changes?
Do you want me to go? Or?
Either one of you, whoever wants to go first.
So I was about to go on a self-directed artist residency. I'd gotten a grant, and I was going to go down to Willapa Bay right before COVID hit. So I had to cancel everything, and everything changed. I was I couldn't really work. I was trying to make my family safe, and my mom lives on the island, and I was just trying to support everybody. And the way I found my the way I found myself back in the studio was, or not in the studio, I just started drawing. I started drawing the trees right around in my yard, and just to ground myself. And I didn't have this sense of expansion. I just wanted to be present and have some relief, and be able to just see and to kind of take advantage of where I was. I normally drive for my inspiration. You know, I love Nisqually and Port Townsend and more open spaces in a way than Bainbridge has a lot of water. I mean, it's an island, but there's also a lot of trees and it's hard to see the horizon. Mm-hmm. So it was interesting just to really react to where I was. And I think that was, you know, my way back in. Although I'm back to the wetlands, and I'm actually going to be going in about 3 weeks, and so I'm really excited about that because in some ways I think I've needed to find some sense of serenity, and that, so making spaces that feel like they invite me in, almost like telling a story, or I think, as opposed to just reacting to kind of the present anxiety. It's like I think I'm deliberately trying to create worlds that offer that respite and that create a kind of interior space. And so I have a number of larger Willapa wetlands started in the studio, and I'm really excited to you know, to be able to go and have a more focused time down there.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah. I mean, I think that's really interesting and poignant, like how we come back to the space to ground us when everything feels out of control, and like, what can we do in the moment and in the actual, you know, place that we are, like literal place we are.
Yeah.
So I definitely, yeah, I feel that. Thank you. How about you, Cara?
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that sense of like coming back to a grounded place. For me, I've been lucky to have access to equipment during this time. I know a lot of artists have not had that access. And I think for me, I expected when all this started that it would be really hard to be inspired and really hard to be motivated, and just a sense of overwhelming everything happening. But I was surprised to find that it's really become like an activity and a place and a time that I can use to be more quiet and more sort of meditative. And a lot of the work that I do is, you know, highly detailed, and so it's a lot of like repetitive line work and things. And I found that it's been a really kind of like soothing activity for me. So by day I do software engineering, so all of my art time has to be on nights and weekends. And so before all of this started, it's always very hard to balance that time. And so you know, there's a lot of social activities as well outside of work, and just you know, life responsibilities. And so it was always hard for me to find dedicated time for art. But now all of that's changed. So I now have many more evenings and weekends that I can dedicate to art, which has felt really good. And it's been really motivating to be able to see progress a little faster. And so yeah, it's definitely been kind of like a refuge, I would say, in these times.
Nice. I'm glad that you found that time and space to be grounding for you. I think so. It's 7:23. So what I'd like to say is, if we have questions, you can put them in the chat if you want. We can go to anybody who wants to turn their video on to ask a question, or just put it in the chat and then you can turn your video on and ask the question. Otherwise, we'll keep talking if that's comfortable for Wendy and Cara. I think the other thing that I know we were thinking about, that's escaping my COVID brain right now. What were what were the other things that we were wanting to maybe discuss a little bit?
I think Wendy had some experience to share on sort of like having to take a break from art and coming back to it.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. I had my 2 kids when I was 37 and 40, and was basically a stay-at-home mom, and I felt lucky to be able to do that. But I was not making a lot of art those first years, and but I was looking a lot, and so there was this tension between being inspired. Actually, I was tired, but I was always kind of interested. I was always looking, and then not being able to rush back to the studio to make anything. And so when I began to have a little bit more time, as you know, the kids had a little bit of childcare and then going to school, and one of the things that was really kind of wonderful about that time was I just became very unself-conscious, and I just made what I wanted to make. And my initial, so this is when I was shifting to working tonally, and I didn't have the technique I had a strong sense of what I was after. I didn't know how they should look as monotypes, but I was interested in you know, capturing the sky and capturing my experience of landscape. And so I made a ton of work, really clumsy. A lot of it was super clumsy, but I wasn't trying to show. I was, I just had this private time to go after my art, and it slowly started to build. And I started getting, you know, I felt like I was making some progress, but it was definitely slow because I didn't have a lot of time. And I think having that break, so making work in a certain way, and the work I made before was, I'd say, looser and more, probably more abstract, and I think less specific in a way. And so I was so surprised that I started to make the work I was making. It really was, it wasn't intentional in a way, but I was absolutely driven to do it. And I think that's when I really came into my own, because I was just being led by curiosity and not what I thought the art should look like. You know, and so I think this play of, or this balance of being really interested in abstraction and trying to make work that felt really believable, and so, but making it out of loose marks and just a kind of almost like roughness. So that really felt like magic to me, you know, following that kind of combination. So it was, you know, it's kind of a long process, but I wasn't trying to be an artist particularly. I kind of went underground for a time, and then when I was ready, things happen. You know, I feel like things happen more easily because I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I was making my work. And there was a lot of freedom. You know, and I still feel that. I feel a lot of freedom with following my own interests and my own direction as an artist.
Yeah. So we have a couple comments, and maybe we'll start with Nikki's question for you, Wendy, just because you were talking, and then Cara will come to some from Kilda. So Nikki writes, I'm curious to know more about Wendy's experience with grad school and the transition out of grad school into her professional practice.
Yeah. I hated grad school. I learned so much, but I hated it. I was living in Taos, New Mexico, and then I went to Washington, D.C. for grad school. And all my inspiration went away. I was, and I had to work. And so I think one of the things that I learned was how to work without inspiration, how to break things down, how to like, so I was incredibly process oriented and rule oriented. And I had made, and before that point, I had been absolutely relying on inspiration. And, you know, when I was in Taos, I was doing these very abstract landscapes that were more spiritual. And I grew up on the East Coast where, you know, that wasn't, it wasn't encouraged so much. I grew up in a very academic, you know, I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut. And so there was a lot of freedom when I went to Taos, and I, you know, I had really strong feelings. And then when I went to grad school, it was all about, you know, being very verbal and being able to defend everything you do. And so I think it took me a long time when I graduated to really find my way back to inspiration. And now I feel like it's a combination. Like inspiration is really important to me, but I don't depend on it. And so I'm thankful for grad school, because as hard as it was, I feel like I developed a kind of toughness and resilience in my own work process. So,
I mean, it seems like the process that you do now of all the experimentation, but it being very like, but being very specific about what you do put in the world and that you feel is ready, sort of speaks to that more dedicated work, you know, process with, I mean, incorporating the inspiration, but also just being very oriented to getting the line or the atmosphere that you want, or the shapes and how you want it, and playing with your tools to make those and see what's gonna feel right for you.
Yeah, and I think that's true. And I also grew up with scientists. So I was around, you know, my dad was a geologist and my mom taught biology and botany. And so I grew up around experiments, and that's, and in a very creative way. Like, they're both very creative people. And so, you know, I feel like that in a way I'm kind of influenced really deeply by that too. Yeah,
I love that. That's great. And Kelda says, Wendy, you are a hero for your child.
Well, I think of you, Kelda, with your kids and everything that you do. You are extraordinary. I'm like, you're my hero. Really, you really are.
Wonderful. And she sends you a heart. So Cara, Kelda also asks or says, comments, Cara's work makes me think about magical realism and the way this jolting from merging with reality helps to gain perspective on suffocating times like these. I wonder if magic realism and or sci-fi does influence Cara's work.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a huge fan of sci-fi fantasy books and material and shows and everything, and also magical realism. I have always appreciated 100 Years of Solitude, the book, and sort of I found that it seems to be a common theme in a lot of Latin American literature. I also just finished The House of Spirits by Isabel Allende. And I definitely, there's something, I don't know, really intriguing and jarring about this magical realism where, you know, everything's normal except there's these completely abnormal things, but they're normal, you know, none of the characters are reacting as though this is an abnormal. And so I think that sense of disorientation definitely is something that impacts my art, and I sort of enjoy making pieces that sort of challenge reality, or there's something about it where you're just like, this is like what what is this, or how does this happen? So for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, in your in some of the questions that Nikki had asked you, just to have us get to know you better, for the gallery and for me, you were referencing like the intersection between logic and art. And I guess, I mean, I think like, or what I'm maybe making the connection between like how you're working and Wendy's working, like, is that experimentation and allowing this experimentation. And, you know, I guess, and for me, like that really resonates for the period that I feel like I am in, and then a lot of us are in. Like, we don't know what's going to happen, and like, can we allow, I mean, I look at it as, can I allow myself to do these different things, since there's no precedent in my lifetime and my experience for what's happening. And so why not go forth with an experimental, adventurous attitude?
Art is way less scary, given how scary.
Yeah, it's true. I feel like a lot of things just feel less scary because of how scary everything else is.
Yeah, it's true. It's where we have some control too. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyone want to ask a video question, or do Cara and Wendy, do you have anything else that you want to talk about before we maybe just have a visiting time for anyone that wants to visit, turn on videos and audio and visit?
I just have one comment for Wendy. I love you sharing your story about, you know, taking time off from art and coming back, because I feel like it's often easy to feel like you should always be creating, and that it's just gonna, like, if you're not always creating, then somehow you're not doing it right, or you're failing or something. And so it's always reassuring to hear people share stories about sort of the ebb and flow in ability to create and motivation to create, or yeah, just changing circumstances. So I think that's really cool.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, I'm so impressed that you work full time at such a high level job, and that you're able to make the art you make. And that takes so much discipline to combine those things.
Thanks. Yeah, I just create very slowly.
Yeah, but it adds up.
Eventually.
Yeah.
I guess I do have, I'm thinking about some of the things that we've talked about, and it might not be completely coherent, so bear with me a little bit. Like, thinking about some of the things that we've talked about, like, and maybe framing it in more of a, like, non-masculine or patriarchal way of looking at art and how we approach making art, and like allowing there to be, you know, periods where we're making and we're not making, yeah. Looking where there's rest, you know, kind of mimicking the seasons, thinking about nature, and then also like allowing that, yeah, that experimentation, and also like that things can be non-toxic or less toxic, and we don't have to be painting with lead paint.
Oh my gosh.
Does that like resonate with either of you in terms of like your framework of how you think about making?
Well, I think I don't, I'm not so concerned with how it should look now. Like, what does it mean to be a serious artist? I'm not so concerned about that. And I think I had a really strong idea of that when I was, you know, growing up on the East Coast, and the orientation towards New York, academia. There was a certain, and it was very male, and so I think my instinct to go west was so great, and I feel really thankful for that. So, because there's more space, and there's more ways that people balance things, and it's not so, you know, you aren't so defined by what you do, that there's multiple ways that you can, you know, balance your life. And so I needed that freedom to really make my work. I did not want to just only focus on work. I'm not enough of an introvert to do that too. Like I really like seeing people and connecting and you know, and this is the first time I haven't taught in 25 years, I think. And I really miss, you know, I miss that experience. And so I think just I don't have this idea of what it should look like. And it's just my life, you know, and doing what makes sense for my life as an artist.
Mm-hmm. I would love to hear a little bit more about your teaching, because I know that's a big part of what you have been doing. And then also, like, was it when you started printmaking that you felt that, like, I mean, I guess you've spoken to that, but like that freedom of like, it doesn't have to look like this, like when you had your kids, that it could look different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that gap was really important, because I couldn't have made that switch if I had just been working the whole time. So that was, and I didn't know that that was the gift out of that time, but it turns out it was, that by the time I came back to making, I couldn't really remember what I was supposed to do. I just started. And that was okay.
Yeah.
And in terms of teaching, did you have a question about teaching, or was
well, just like in terms of how, like not doing it right now, or if you're doing it like via Zoom, or like what that loss is like, or like what are you looking at toward the future? You know, whatever.
I'm not really looking at the future in terms of teaching right now, but I've definitely been approached about teaching, and I was supposed to be teaching in Italy actually in September. I was gonna teach with a calligrapher. We were doing a calligraphy and monotype workshop, which I did last year. So clearly that's not happening. Initially it was because we couldn't, you know, they didn't, so we couldn't go to Italy, and now it's because they don't want us. So, but I think it's okay, and I'm hoping that eventually, you know, come back to teaching. But I just feel like I like the simplicity of this time in a certain way. There's less. I don't know. There's a kind of just slow time that is not bad for art making, and I'm trying to take advantage of that as opposed to miss what my life was before.
Sure.
So both my kids are 18 and 21, and they're both home, and so there's a sweetness and a kind of you know, I just I'm okay with it right now, but I really hope to be able to teach again. I'm not rushing to Zoom though, because I don't want to yet. Maybe eventually.
Yeah. And Cara, I mean, if we can remember my question.
Yeah, so I think your question was about just sort of frameworks for creating and in context of a patriarchal system versus.
Wow, what a good memory.
I could have never done that, by the way.
No.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I see similar problems and challenges in the software engineering field as well, because it's a largely male-dominated industry. And there's certain attitudes that tend to favor men, and there's a lot of sort of thinking and you know, toxic masculinity that impacts other people's ability to contribute or I guess get recognized for their contributions. And there's a lot of activity in that field as well, like let's rethink the way that we think about achievement, and you know, taking breaks is healthy, and this is a marathon, not a sprint, and just sort of like healthier ways of being and creating. And so I think, I guess for me, that's already so imbued in my daily life that I don't know that I've like consciously transitioned that over to art. But I think for me, what I think about a lot is the way that art fits into a capitalist system. And so when I have a degree in graphic design, and I got that degree thinking, oh, well, like I want to be able to make a living and I'm too afraid to just launch and become an artist. So maybe I can do commercial art and that'll be a way to like do art and make a living. But of course, as probably many people have encountered, when you're making art for somebody else, for me, it became a different thing. It wasn't the inspiration that I wanted, and it didn't feel like that flow, that creation that you might feel when you're creating something just from inspiration. And so that ended up leading me to abandon that as an activity because I just couldn't, it was too hard for me to try to use my inspiration and my artistic thinking and creativity, but have it sort of shifted and changed and taken away. And it's not about what I want so much as what somebody else wants, which is not a bad thing either, but it's just not what I was looking for. And so for me, coming back to art after many years has been something I've had to think about a lot, because while I think it would be really satisfying, or I imagine that it would be satisfying to be able to switch to art full time and do that as a living, I feel like I would encounter the same thing, which is that it changes a bit when you have to make money off of this endeavor and you have to be able to get by, and it's like the way that you think about pieces might change, unless you're like so lucky to be just very successful. But yeah, and so I think doing art as a side activity, or just like on the side, has been freeing for me in a way, because I can do it. I can make what I want to make, as like Wendy was describing, like I can think of ideas, and basically there's nothing for me to lose there. And it's always surprised me like how much that changes the level of inspiration, and just this feeling of flow, and this feeling of like peace when you're making the work, and it just feels really natural and good. And so I've always struggled to decide whether it's better to have that but be limited in my art making abilities, or like time and effort, or to switch, but then maybe it would change the nature of how I'm able to create. So
right, yeah, or seasons, maybe now is now and maybe later it will be different.
Yeah.
Thank you. Really great to speak with you. Thank you so much. I'm excited to see your pieces in person. Yeah, everybody, thank you all for joining. I think we will say goodbye now and turn off the recording, but we can stay and have, turn on the videos and turn on the audio and, visit with everybody. So thank you all for joining. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was really so much fun. Thank you.
Yeah.